Intel CPU.
Welcome back to Tech Yes City, and today we have a stock out-of-the-box cooler comparison here between Intel and AMD. And this is brought about by Intel, well, at least what they're claiming is their new included box cooler, which they decided to start introducing with the 10th generation i7 and i9 non-K processors, but have since included it now with the i5 lineup, and that being, of course, the most important CPU in their 11th gen lineup, the 11400F. However, this cooler right here, even though Intel claims it's new, the only thing I'm seeing new about this is literally the paint job, where they've made it black and they've changed the logo to gray instead of putting a sticker on. So this thing here weighs in at 223 grams, and ironically enough, the older cooler right here from 2nd and 3rd gen Intel CPUs, which was included with their i5 and i7 products, say for instance an i5-11400, this one weighed in at 226 grams, and it also has the copper slug in the middle. So very similar. I don't think Intel have done anything new here. But looking back through Intel's history of box coolers, they actually used to give you a lot more cooler included in the box. This here being one of the old school generation X58 stock coolers. It has a different socket mounting mechanism, but they also included similar sizes to this cooler right here in things like X79 and also LGA 775 processors. But after what some would consider the golden days of CPU evolution, Intel then decided to cut costs, and we went down to this 220 gram cooler right here. And then subsequently, even on i3s and lower power consumption CPUs, they even dropped in a 170 gram cooler without even having the copper slug in the middle. So looks like we've gone through this down curve, and now we're on the way up a little bit. But some say this wouldn't have been possible without the introduction of AMD's Ryzen and their box coolers, where I'm holding here the Wraith Stealth, and we're also going to be testing out the Wraith Prism, and I'll put the weights and specs of these CPU coolers up on the screen here for you guys. But what we're going to be doing here today is we're going to be checking two different levels of power consumption, and that is 65 watts and 100 watts. And we're going to have a box cooler round robin to see the noises and temperatures of these CPUs. So let's get on with the show. If you want to get rid of this annoying activate Windows message, then today's video sponsor SCD Keys has you covered for as little as $12 US. After you enter that coupon code BFTYC, you can cop yourself a legit single end user license today. Links in the description below. So after beginning the test between the AMD and Intel coolers, I realized this was not going to work properly unless I had the same base constant. And in this case, that was using the Intel CPU, but we had the problem of mounting the coolers that wouldn't fit properly on the Intel CPU, namely the Ryzen CPU coolers. So I decided to do a cool experiment where we're now using the Intel Extreme Tuning utility, which has the option to manually set your power limits on the CPU. So this can give us an apples to apples comparison between the actual power being output by the CPU and the temperatures incurred by the CPU cooler. However, since the CPU we are using in today's comparison is the 11400F, it does have two different states that it likes to switch between: the 65 watt state and also the 100 watt state. The 100 watt state is pretty much around the max level of performance for the 4.2 GHz all-core when we're running a test like Cinebench R20, for example. However, when we're gaming, this CPU can go up to 75 watts. And we will talk about this more in an upcoming video, but we've also talked about it in the H510 video that we recently did, where I'll put the link to that video up here. However, for what it is worth, the 65 watt limit will remain on some H510s especially, and possibly even some B560 motherboards. So it is important, in my opinion, to test all today's coolers at these two different wattage settings. However, let the test begin, and let's get you guys some numbers. So now that testing is finished, you may have a question before going into these results, and that is, how did you get a Ryzen CPU cooler to mount on an Intel CPU socket? That is the LGA 1200, and even the LGA old school cooler to mount in this socket, even though the coolers won't fit. And the answer to this is I actually just applied careful pressure on the CPU and the cooler itself. And that gave us accurate results where we tested at 25 degrees ambient temperatures. And what we'll see with the results is we'll pull the 100-watt results up first. And here we saw that the Wraith Prism was doing a fantastic job on the temperatures, though I have included the noise levels because it is important to note that the fans out of the box will spin at different levels. And of course, inherent to the fan that's been used on the cooler itself, you will get different noise even if you have the same RPM, just because there's different fans being used on the coolers themselves. But what we're seeing move over to the Wraith Stealth is that's a very quiet cooler, even at this 100-watt level, where it goes up to 88 degrees, but it did get some of the lowest noise in today's comparison. However, looking at the previous generation 170-gram cooler, that maxed out at 33 decibels, so it was extremely quiet, but unfortunately it did start thermal throttling at 100 watts. However, looking at the black cooler a little bit more in depth, we can see that it does beat out the second and third gen cooler that does have similar weight and also has the copper slug, beat it out by about 6 degrees, but this was coming in with a much lower noise level of 42 decibels versus 50 decibels. Though even more impressive was the OG cooler, the big Intel stock cooler that they've included with older generation CPUs, and that was giving out 38 decibels. So it beat out both the second gen and also the new black cooler quite substantially when we look at it from a noise and temperature perspective. But for what it's worth, I thought the Wraith Stealth was actually winning this comparison, believe it or not, being that it had a really low noise level and the temperatures were still absolutely fine. Though although the 88 degrees may seem a little bit hot, it's actually fine where it's still got another 12 degrees until it starts thermal throttling. And as long as you keep it under that level, it's still going to perform at its maximum performance level. They also did throw in an H115i RGB Platinum just for reference to see how good water cooling can get, although it is kind of irrelevant in this case because the water cooler itself will cost more than the CPU in questions. Though it does prove one thing, and that is the statement, pay to win, is true indeed. Though stepping things down to 65 watts, which is a limit imposed on some H510 motherboards. Also, if you're using older CPUs like the 10400F, this will be a relevant comparison. Even when we look at something like the Ryzen 5 3600, that I believe will use around 45 watts when it comes to playing games. So any of these coolers here in today's comparison will do a fine job of keeping the temperatures under control. Even the 170-gram cooler came in at 33 decibels and went up to 91 degrees. So that was the quietest of the bunch. And then from here, we can see that the black cooler came in with a decent temperature level, but it was still running at the loudest of all the coolers in today's comparison. So the noise levels did concern me a bit about this new Intel cooler, to the point where 50 decibels might annoy people because it is quite a loud noise coming out of this cooler. Whereas we look at the Wraith Stealth, that did a phenomenal job of handling the temperatures at around 70 degrees, but also coming in with 34 decibels of noise. Then the Wraith Prism ended up dropping the noise levels down further from the 100-watt level, but also dropped the temperatures down 7 degrees. And the OG Intel cooler came out here with a massive win of 62 degrees and still maintaining some very impressive noise levels. Now, the previous second-gen cooler, in my opinion, even though it got 5 degrees hotter, it did maintain much lower noise levels than that of the all-black cooler. So after analyzing those results, I can conclude that the all-black cooler here from Intel is not doing that good of a job when it comes to especially keeping the noise levels down. Those noise levels were actually quite bad, but the temperatures were okay, they were mediocre. I would say, if anything, the Wraith Stealth did a much better job because I could barely hear it when it came to the actual noise levels. And looking even back at the second and third gen cooler, and then even the lightweight 170-gram cooler, those did much better in terms of noise levels. However, there were reports coming in, people were saying, okay, Brian, the all-black cooler does throttle the 11400F. I didn't see any throttling due to the cooler itself. If you're looking at throttling on the 11400F, that would be mainly due to the motherboard and the boost limits in place. Especially if there's a 65-watt limit in place, you do have to make sure that you remove that. And the only way I found to remove that on the H510 motherboard was to disable that TAU and then up the manual settings to 100 watts. And that seemed to alleviate the problem, even though if you have a Z590, for example, you will get slightly higher performance because it will boost over just over 100 watts. But this will only mainly be limited to Cinebench, for example, where you're using the AVX2 instruction sets, and it will slightly boost higher than 100 watts momentarily. So you probably see that you will get slightly higher results on a Z590 than a H510, especially if that H510 motherboard or even a B560 has a 100 watt limit in place. It's not actually the fault of this cooler. This cooler will even handle 108 watts and do a fine job without the CPU throttling itself. But one thing I did notice was that there was no thermal constraints put in place in terms of our testing setup. We just used an open air test bed, 25 degrees ambience. So if you do have a case that is very limited in airflow, which I believe would be a possible scenario because a lot of people buying the 11400F combo, especially if they're using a H510, are probably going to cheap out on the case. But one thing I'll say is if you're going to cheap out on the case, just make sure you leave a side panel off. That's one thing to keep in mind. But back to the all black cooler, I feel as if Intel have upped the fan speeds at the cost of noise, but also when we look at the noise levels compared to the other fans used in today's comparison, I feel as if they've used a cheaper fan than previous generations. However, considering the price of the 11400F and considering you get this in the box and it does look a lot better, I don't think it's a bad thing. The 11400F, especially in today's market where things are inflating at crazy prices, I'd say the 11400F is actually a shining gem that should be considered, especially if you are on a budget. But for what it's worth, if I had the choice between both these CPU coolers, the Wraith Stealth and the all black, I'd pick the Wraith Stealth just due to it having a much quieter noise profile out of the box. And the thing is, I decided to test the out of the box profiles because if you're buying the CPUs and using the respective CPU coolers, that's what you're gonna get out of the box. Anyway guys, with that aside, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button for us. Also let us know in the comments section below, did you enjoy this CPU cooler showdown? Or if you didn't, just let us know too. I mean, I always like feedback. Just like this question of the day here, which comes from Crash Test Dummy, and they ask, now RAM speed depends on PCB thickness. WTF Intel, just unlock everything already. And my sentiments with this is the exact same as Crash Test Dummy. I think Intel just need to stop doing these kind of little things where they've basically implemented a limit on H510 motherboards where if the manufacturer only uses a 4-layer PCB, there's a limit of 2933 megahertz as opposed to a 6-layer PCB, there's a 3200 megahertz memory limit on the 11th gen chips. Now the 10th gen chips, they've still got, at least from the H510 tests I did, they've still got a 2666 limit. So there's no reason for Intel to put these limits in place. Just unlock them already and give people more value for money. I don't think it's a hard thing to do since the person's already invested in Intel. You should be grateful that they've gone for an Intel CPU and motherboard and not an AMD CPU and motherboard. I mean, for Intel and the marketing reps out there, they really need to take a look at customer loyalty and realize at the moment with Intel, it's the antonym of customer loyalty. So you guys need to make your brand name synonymous with customer loyalty. And that means you're doing the best by the customer. But hey, what would I know? I'm just a dude pulling clips off an AMD Wraith Stealth cooler. And with that aside, if you guys have stayed this far, be sure to hit that sub button, ring that bell, and I'll catch you in another juicy tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.
We are going to have to ask if we want to live in a different world.